Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm here once again wearing my Classics and Cats t-shirt, which can mean only one thing. It is time for another year of Jane Austen July. So today I am very pleased to be announcing another year of Jane Austen July. If you don't know what Jane Austen July is, it is a month-long readathon all about reading and celebrating Jane Austen and books about and related to Jane Austen. This is the 7th Jane Austen July. I can't believe it's been going for quite so long. And Jane Austen July is hosted by me, by Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and by Claudia from Spencer's Library. I'll link their channels and their announcement videos down below. And I'm very excited to be bringing you another Jane Austen July because I love Jane Austen July. It's so much fun every year. I just really enjoy reading lots of Jane Austen and related things. If you want to take part in Jane Austen July, then it runs for the whole month from the 1st to the 31st of July. There's a Goodreads group to join, which I'll leave in the description down below, and you can also post about it on BookTube, BookTok, Bookstagram, wherever you like, with the hashtag Jane Austen July. There are some challenges, there are some read-alongs, I have some videos planned, and I'm just pretty excited for this readathon, as I am every year. Let me talk you through the challenges for Jane Austen July. The challenges do stay the same every year for Jane Austen July, so there are no massive surprises here, but we have some different read-alongs and I have some recommendations for you, and hopefully you can enjoy getting stuck into another year of Jane Austen July. So the first challenge of Jane Austen July is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. So you could read Pride and Prejudice or Mansfield Park, which are my 2 personal favourites. You could read Emma, you could read Northanger Abbey, you could read Persuasion, or you could read Sense and Sensibility, which is in fact one of our group reads for this year. So this year we are going to be doing a read-along of Sense and Sensibility from the 1st to the 16th of July. So I'll be reading basically 3 chapters every day and then 4 chapters for the last 2 days. I'll leave a schedule down below in the description if I have space, and if not, it'll be on the Goodreads group. I am really excited to reread Sense and Sensibility. I have read it quite a lot of times, and I also used to not like it that much. It had been historically my least favourite Jane Austen novel, and then 2 years ago I reread it and something clicked, and now I absolutely love it and it's one of my favourites. It's probably my 3rd favourite after Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park. I reread it last year, I reread it the year before, I think I might have even reread it the year before that. I've been rereading Sense and Sensibility a lot lately, so I'm really excited to reread it again. So Sense and Sensibility, if you don't know, it follows the story of 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood have grown up with their mother and their younger sister and their father, but their father has recently passed away at the beginning of the book, and their father has a son from a previous marriage, and on their father's death the property all goes to their half-brother rather than to them. So they end up leaving Northern, this home they have loved, and moving to a cottage, and we follow the friendship between these 2 sisters. They're very, very different temperaments and their romantic relationships. Marianne is very, very emotional and has a lot of sensibility. She wears her heart on her sleeve and thinks very highly of her emotions, thinks that the best way to be in life is to be led by your emotions, whereas Eleanor has a lot of sense. She's very sensible and doesn't let her emotions rule her, and this book is about these 2 siblings, and I love it very, very much. I think it is fantastic. I really clicked with it when I stopped reading it as a love story and started reading it as a sibling story, and I just think it's fantastic and really worth your time. So very, very excited that this is our read-along for this year. And then the second challenge of Jane Austen July is to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. So you could read her wonderful epistolary novella Lady Susan, you could read some of Jane Austen's letters, or you could read some of her juvenilia, or you could read some of her unfinished books. And that is what we are going to be doing for our other read-along this Jane Austen July. So we are going to be reading Jane Austen's 2 unfinished novels, Sanditon and The Watsons. Both of them are really beginnings. I feel like even calling them unfinished novels is a bit much because they are sort of not even quarters of novels. Really, she stopped very early on while writing them. The Watsons she gave up on and decided she didn't want to finish it, and Sanditon she was writing when she passed away. So we're going to be reading both of these in the month of July, which I think will be really fun and interesting to read her unfinished novels and have a think about what they might have been like if they were finished. So we're going to be reading Sanditon from the 17th to the 22nd of July, 2 chapters a day, and then The Watsons Watsons, we're going to be reading from the 23rd to the 31st of July. The Watsons, at least in my edition and Marissa and Claudia's editions, doesn't have chapters, so we're just going to read it loosely in that time frame rather than setting a schedule. But I think it'll be really interesting to read these two unfinished works and have a chat about them. Then the third challenge of Jane Austen July is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or her time. There are lots of different directions you could take this. You could read a biography such as Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley, or The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things by Paula Byrne, or you could read a non-fiction book that is about the time period in which Jane Austen lived. Two books I often recommend for this are Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James, or Eavesdropping on Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Adkins, both of which I find really, really interesting. Or you could read a work of literary criticism about Jane Austen. My two favourite works of literary criticism I have ever read about Jane Austen are What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen and The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne. I think those two books are fantastic and have really revolutionised the way I think about Jane Austen, or just heightened and enriched the way I think about Jane Austen in just a fantastic way. The fourth challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. And I have so many recommendations for this. There are so many different books you could pick for this, and there are lots of different directions you could go in. So you could read a modern retelling, which takes a story from Jane Austen and brings it into the modern world. Two YA retellings of Jane Austen I'd really recommend are Pride by E.B. Zaboy, which is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Dass, which is a retelling of Persuasion. I'd also really recommend Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg, which is a wonderful queer retelling of Pride and Prejudice that I read last year and really loved. And I also wanted to mention The Manor House Governess by C.A. Castle, which is another queer kind of take on Jane Austen and Jane Eyre. I would say this is like a Jane Austen Bronte mashup in the best way possible, and it's really, really fun and well worth your time. Or you could read a historical retelling, a book that retells a Jane Austen story but set in the time of Jane Austen, often taking a minor character from a Jane Austen book and looking at their life. There are a lot of fantastic books like this, especially for Pride and Prejudice. You could read Longbourn by Jo Baker, which is about the servants from Pride and Prejudice. You could read Charlotte by Helen Moffat, which is all about Charlotte Lucas. You could read The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, which is all about Mary Bennet. Or you could read What Kitty Did Next by Carrie Cableen, which is all about Kitty Bennet. I also really recommend Unequal Affections by Laura Armstrong, which is about minor Pride and Prejudice spoiler coming up. What would have happened if Elizabeth had accepted Mr. Darcy the first time he proposed? Really, really interesting thought experiment. Fantastic book. I also enjoyed Jane Fairfax by Joan Aiken, which looks at Jane Fairfax from Emma, and I would be very keen to read more historical retellings about characters that aren't from Pride and Prejudice, so maybe I need to have a look out for them as well. One other book I wanted to mention, which takes Jane Austen characters in a historical setting but is doing something slightly different, is The Murder of Mr. Wickham by Claudia Gray. This book takes a lot of different Jane Austen characters and puts them in a big house party where a murder occurs and then there is a mystery to solve. I read The Murder of Mr. Wickham last Jane Austen July and I just thought it was so fun. I know there is a second book in the series, The Late Mrs. Willoughby, I think, which I'm hopefully going to read this Jane Austen July, and I just really, really enjoyed this one. I would highly recommend it, and I think it did something really fun and different with the Jane Austen retelling, so that's a great one to read. Another thing you could do is read a book which features Jane Austen as a character, and in fact, while we're talking about murder mysteries with The Murder of Mr. Wickham, I also wanted to mention Miss Austen Investigates by Jessica Bull. I'm holding up a proof here, but I'll put the final cover up on the screen too. But this is a wonderful, really, really fun murder mystery novel in which Jane Austen is the sleuth. She is 19 years old when a murder happens at a ball that she is attending, and she goes about solving this murder mystery with the wild imagination and enthusiasm that Catherine Morland from Northanger Abbey would bring to solving a murder mystery, and it is excellent and massive fun, and I highly, highly recommend it. Two other books that feature Jane Austen as a character and that I love are these two by Jill Hornby. We have Miss Austen, which focuses on Jane Austen's sister Cassandra, and Godmersham Park, which focuses on the governess to Jane Austen's niece, but Jane Austen features as a character too. I love these books so much. Jill Hornby is one of my favourite writers, and these two are really fantastic, well worth your time. And then a couple of years ago, I also read a book called The Jane Austen Project by Kathleen Flynn about two time travellers from the future going back in time to meet Jane Austen, which I found glorious and delightful and silly in all the best ways, and also surprisingly heartfelt, so I'd really recommend that one too. And then of course the other part of this challenge is that you can read a book that is set in Jane Austen's time. At some point between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, you can be fairly loose with this. But I have a few different authors and books I wanted to recommend. First, I want to recommend the fantastic author Lex Croucher. I'm just holding up one of their books here, but they have written 3 Regency books, which all kind of like have rom-com elements. They're not entirely rom-coms, but they have rom-com elements. So there's Reputation, Infamous, and Trouble. I love them all. I think they're fantastic. The kind of books that will like give you all the Regency joy you want, but also like subvert lots of stuff in an excellent way. So yes, highly recommend. I also really recommend Sophie Irwin. I loved her first book, A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting, and I'm hopefully going to read her second book, A Lady's Guide to Scandal, this Jane Austen July. It's been on my Kindle for ages, and I'm really, really excited to read it. And then there are 2 very big authors who write stuff set in the Regency period that I haven't read anything from, but I always hear good things about, and that's Georgette Heyer and Julia Quinn. I might try a Bridgerton book this Jane Austen July. I didn't massively get on with the TV adaptation, which I think is a very unusual opinion, so I feel like maybe I should give the books a try. Maybe they won't be for me, I don't know. And then a couple of other books I wanted to mention. Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller is a wonderful book set in England during the Napoleonic Wars, and it really picks apart like all the dark historical context that sometimes you are not aware of when you're reading Jane Austen. There's also Learn by Heart by Emma Donoghue, which I read recently, which is partly set in 1814 and follows the kind of growing romantic relationship between 2 girls at boarding school, both of whom are based on real historical figures, one of which is Anne Lister, who I'll talk about in a minute. And then another book I wanted to mention is this. This is The Bone Hunters by Joanne Byrne. So this is technically a bit after Jane Austen. This book is set in 1824 and Jane Austen died in 1817. But, you know, being fairly loose with our years, I think it would still count for Jane Austen July. And this book is all about fossil hunters in Lyme Regis, which is another reason why I think it's a quite fun one to read for Jane Austen July, because parts of Persuasion take place in Lyme Regis, so it feels like an Austen-y place. And I just thought this was a really great read. And then the 5th challenge for Jane Austen July, and the final reading challenge of Jane Austen July, is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. So someone who was writing at the time when Jane Austen was alive. Jane Austen was born in 1775 and died in 1817, so use those dates as your rough dates. Try and read something that was published between those dates, but if you want to give it a few years either way, that is absolutely fine. There are of course so many choices of authors to read that were writing during Jane Austen's time. One of Jane Austen's favourite writers was Frances Burney. I really enjoyed her book Evelina. Another of Jane Austen's favourite writers was Maria Edgeworth, and last year I read Belinda, which I loved and found fascinating, like really, really, really historically interesting. So very much a book that's worth your time. You could read something by Sir Walter Scott or Mary Shelley. One book that I read a couple of years ago in Jane Austen July, which was really interesting, was this. This is The Woman of Colour, a tale by an anonymous writer about a half Jamaican, half British heiress moving from Jamaica to England. I think there are 2 main things that make this book really interesting. One of which is that it is about a person of colour in the Regency period, which is not something you read about all that much, but also I think it is a really interesting novel because it's very much a sentimental novel, and especially with one of our group reads this year being Sensibility, which is kind of as much of a takedown as sentimental novels as Northanger Abbey is of Gothic novels, but it's harder to know that as a modern reader because we're much more familiar with Gothic tropes than like the sentimental novel tropes. But I think if you want to understand sentimental novels, then The Woman of Colour is quite a good book to read because it has lots of interesting elements, but it also has that really like sentimental Regency feel to it. But of course you don't have to read a novel for this challenge. You could read poetry by, you know, William Blake, William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, William Cooper, and so many more. Or you could read a play. In previous Jane Austen Julys, I've enjoyed plays by Elizabeth Inchbald, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Hannah Cowley. Last year I read The Rivals by Sheridan, which was really fantastic, and in fact again is another one that would be quite interesting to read in conjunction with Sensibility because it very much has a lot of the like sentimental sense versus sensibility stuff. One of the reasons why I read it last year was because in The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne, she spoke quite a lot about how The Rivals was a really big influence for Sensibility, and I think you can see that. So I really do recommend The Rivals. I think that would be a good play to read this Jane Austen Austen July. Another thing you could read for this prompt is diaries. Last year I read volume 1 of The Secret Diaries of Anne Lister, and then later on in the year I read volume 2. And these books are fascinating and fantastic. So if you don't know about Anne Lister, she was a real historical figure. In this edition, her diaries are from 1816 to 1824, and then this edition is 1824 to 1826. Anne Lister wrote all her diaries in code. These were decoded later in the 20th century, and one of the main reasons why she wrote her diaries in code is because she was having romantic and sexual relationships with women. And I feel like it's not an exaggeration to say that the first volume of Anne Lister's diaries, I Know My Own Heart, edited by Helen Whitbread, is possibly the most interesting thing I have ever read. Like, as someone who's interested in history, it was just fascinating. Like, the social history in here, both about kind of romantic and sexual relationships, but also about class, is just fantastic and so rich and interesting. But also I was like fully invested in Anne coming of age, like as much as if it was a novel. And I just cannot recommend these books enough. Like, read Anne Lister's diaries. You need to read Anne Lister's diaries. Okay, so those are all the reading challenges for Jane Austen July, but we also have 2 watching challenges. So the 6th challenge for Jane Austen July is to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book. So there are, of course, many options for this. I think I did a video a while back about my favourite screen adaptations of Jane Austen. I'll link that down below. But as our group read is Sensibility this year, I especially wanted to recommend the 2008 Sense and Sensibility miniseries, which is my favourite ever screen adaptation of Austen. Am I going to say that? I think it might be. I think it's fantastic. And I also think because there's a film from the 90s that a lot of people love, which I quite like, but I don't like nearly as much as the 2008 miniseries. So I feel like because so many people love that film, that miniseries gets like a little bit neglected, and I really think it's wonderful and I really recommend it. So please, if you're reading Sense and Sensibility this year, go and watch the 2008 miniseries. It is wonderful. Like, I think it's so good in so many ways. I also have a soft spot for both the 2020 and the 2009 adaptations of Emma, and for the 1995 and the 2005 adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. And I also am very fond of the film Love and Friendship from 2016, which is an adaptation of Lady Susan, which I really like. I also feel like, as Sanditon is one of our group reads this year, it would be remiss of me not to mention the miniseries of Sanditon, which I didn't really get on with and gave up halfway through the first series. So I'm not sure that I'm recommending it, but it is an adaptation of Sanditon, and they did give it an ending, so I guess maybe you might want to watch that. And then the 7th and final challenge of Jane Austen July is to watch a modern screen retelling of a Jane Austen book. So something that takes a Jane Austen story and puts it in the modern day or in a different setting. There are so many of these to choose from. Again, I think 2 of my favourites would be Clueless, which is a modern retelling of Emma, and Fire Island, which is a modern and queer retelling of Pride and Prejudice and is fantastic. Like, I'm very fond of Clueless, but like Fire Island is better. I love Fire Island so much. I feel like there are probably some modern retellings of Sense and Sensibility that I need to get my hands on as well. There are also a lot of fantastic web series out there adapting Jane Austen's novels. In fact, I have a great one to recommend for every Jane Austen book. The Lizzie Bennet Diaries is a fantastic Pride and Prejudice retelling. Emma Approved is a fantastic Emma retelling. From Mansfield with Love, it's a wonderful Mansfield Park retelling, the best Mansfield Park adaptation I've ever seen. Northbound is a great retelling of Northanger Abbey. Rational Creatures is a really great Persuasion retelling, and I would also say it is like the highest production value of all the web series. Like, it looks really professional. If that bothers you, like, it's fantastic. I really recommend it. And then there's also a really fun one that I saw many years ago called Eleanor and Marianne Take Barton, which is a Sense and Sensibility retelling. It's been years since I watched that, but maybe I'll rewatch it this year. I remember really enjoying it at the time. So before I wrap up this video, I did want to talk a little bit about the kind of video plans and that kind of thing for Jane Austen July. I will say that this is going to be a bit of a weird Jane Austen July for me, and probably a less like Jane Austen-y Jane Austen July than usual, because I also have a book coming out in July. So my second novel, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, is coming out on the 18th of July. This is a proof copy. It'll be out in hardback first, and audiobook and ebook. It's coming out in the UK, but you can order it internationally from Blackwell's. I will leave links down below in the description in case anyone is interested. But obviously, having a book come out halfway through July, like my priority is not going to be entirely on Jane Austen July, both in terms of like life and reading. Like I will definitely be quite busy in July, and I will also reread The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst in July. I did this last time I had a book out. I listened to the audiobook on publication week, and it was like such a lovely experience because it made me like fall in love with the book again. I don't know if all writers have this, but like the moment a book goes to press, I'm like, what if it's terrible? So it was really nice to read Hartwood Hall on audiobook the week it came out. I'm going to do the same with The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst in July. So that will at least be a book that isn't like a Jane Austen July book. I mean, I say that, it is quite heavily Austen-inspired, but it's also set in 1841. So it's a few decades after Jane Austen. It's not like historically set in Jane Austen's time. And it's not really a Jane Austen retelling, but there are Austen vibes and Gaskell vibes and Trollope vibes, hence why it is set in the beginning of the Victorian period rather than in the Regency period. It is very much an early Victorian like setting, not a Regency one, but there are Jane Austen vibes and some characters with some Jane Austen influence. So it will be kind of nice to read in Jane Austen July, but that will at least be like a distraction. And I also know that my video making in July is probably going to be a mix of like Jane Austen July, Jane Austen content and like writing vlogs, writing content, because I do have quite a few video plans and ideas, some of which will be up in June and August or whatever, but some of which will be in July, and I will try and like vlog publication week and my book launch and that kind of stuff again. There will be some other videos in Jane Austen July this year that are not entirely about Jane Austen. That's probably fine. I will do a video about how like influences on this book in which I will also talk about Jane Austen, but you know, hopefully there'll still be 3 videos a week as I usually try and do in Jane Austen July, but how much I'm going to manage to get read this Jane Austen July, I don't know. I think chatting to Marissa and Claudia, they're also quite busy this July, so I think we're just going to have a like nice, low-key, chill Jane Austen July, and if we don't read a ton, then that is absolutely fine. But I do have some videos that I'm hoping to make this Jane Austen July. I'm hoping to do an interview with Amanda Fagan, who's a wonderful singer-songwriter who has produced an EP all about Jane Austen. I reviewed that last month, the month before last, and I'm hoping to do an interview with her in July, which will be really fun. I was also thinking that this year I might make a video about Jane Austen's rakes, about like her, you know, bad male characters. I thought that might be quite fun. I thought I might make a video about unrequited love in Jane Austen, and maybe also one looking at Jane Austen's titles and what the titles of her books tell us about her books. I thought as well, as we're rereading Sensibility this year, I would do a video about like siblings and doubling in Sense and Sensibility. I thought that might be quite fun. And I also thought I would do another one of my Let's Talk About videos where I spend a very long time talking about one Jane Austen character. Someone recently in the comments requested Mrs. Jennings, who has been on my mind for a while. So I think maybe on this reread of Sense and Sensibility, I'll be looking out entirely for Mrs. Jennings, who I love, and I will make a video all about her. And I might also reread Emma this Jane Austen July, and if I do, maybe I'll make a video all about Miss Bates. I don't know, I'm thinking about it. I also think maybe once I finish the Watsons, I'll try and make a video just about the Watsons, because I really love the Watsons, and I actually loved it a lot more than Sanditon last time I read those two. And I thought the Watsons was like fantastic and such a great tragedy that Jane Austen never finished it. So I would kind of like to talk about that in a bit more detail if I feel the same this time. And I think those are my main like video thoughts, which is quite enough to be getting on with. If you have any requests, as ever, let me know. This is the 7th Jane Austen July. I still have more to say about Jane Austen, but you know, I could probably always do with some prompts. Otherwise, I think that's all I have to say for now. I hope you're all going to take part in Jane Austen July. Please do let me know down in the comments if you are. If you're looking forward to the read-alongs, go join the Goodreads group, tag us in your TBRs, and let's just all have a fun Jane Austen related July. That is all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.